The Montana winter of 1892 brought more than just snow to Elkhorn Valley. It carried with it the hopes of a woman willing to travel across the country to marry a man she'd never met, and the unexpected awakening of a lonely rancher who learned that true beauty reveals itself to those patient enough to look beyond first impressions. This is the story of Eleanor Adams and Thomas Mitchell, two souls who found each other through desperation, endured the cruelty of others, and discovered that love often blooms in the most unexpected circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Mitchell stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun rise over the mountains that surrounded Elkhorn Valley. The pink-gold light spilled across 600 acres of Montana wilderness, all his. At 34, he'd built Whispering Pines Ranch from nothing but hard work and determination, turning his father's failed homestead into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the region. But success came with a price. 10 years of 16-hour days left little time for courting. Now, with his life finally settled, the sprawling ranch house sat mostly empty, its rooms echoing with silence each night. When Thomas returned from the fields, his sister Martha had suggested it for months before he finally agreed to place the advertisement in the Eastern newspaper. Successful Montana rancher seeks a bride, must be hard-working, God-fearing, and willing to build a life in the West. Age 25-35 preferred. Position offers stability, respect, and the promise of family. The letters came quickly. Most were polite but impersonal. Women desperate to escape factory work or spinsterhood. Then came Eleanor's letter, written in a neat, flowing script that spoke of intelligence and education. Mr. Mitchell, I hope this letter finds you well. Your advertisement spoke of stability and respect, two things I value above all else. I'm 28 years old, educated as a school teacher, though I've spent recent years caring for my ailing parents until their passing last winter. I cook, sew, and keep a tidy home. I enjoy reading and have a particular fondness for poetry. I should be forthright and mention that I am not what society considers conventionally beautiful. I'm a woman of substantial size, which has limited my prospects here in Philadelphia. I understand if this disqualifies me from consideration, but I believe honesty forms the foundation of any worthwhile partnership. If you are still interested, I await your response. Sincerely, Eleanor Adams Thomas had read the letter repeatedly over the following days. Something about her honesty struck him as refreshing. He'd known too many women who used artifice to mask their true selves. Here was someone who presented herself plainly, without pretense. His reply was simple. Miss Adams, your honesty is appreciated. I seek a partner, not an ornament. If you are willing to work alongside me to build something meaningful, I would welcome your arrival. Enclosed is money for your train passage. Respectfully, Thomas Mitchell. Now, 3 months later, Thomas adjusted his tie for the 5th time as the afternoon train whistle echoed through the valley. His ranch foreman, Jackson Reed, leaned against the wagon. Nervous, boss? Don't be ridiculous, Thomas said, though his restless hands betrayed him. It's a practical arrangement. Sure it is, Jackson chuckled. That's why you've been smiling at fence posts all week. Thomas scowled, but there was no real anger behind it. Jackson had been with him since the beginning, more friend than employee. Just drive the wagon. The railway station in Elkhorn Falls was little more than a wooden platform beside the general store. A dozen people milled about, waiting for the train from the east. Mrs. Wilson, the doctor's wife, nodded in Thomas's direction. Big day, Mr. Mitchell, she called. We're all curious to meet this mail-order bride of yours. Thomas nodded stiffly. The term mail-order bride grated on him, though he couldn't argue its technical accuracy. Still, it reduced something he hoped would become meaningful to a mere transaction. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and screeching brakes. Passengers began disembarking. A salesman, a family returning from visiting relatives, a young man who looked to be a new hand for the Carson Ranch. Then came a woman in a simple blue traveling dress, her figure noticeably fuller than the others around her. Eleanor Adams stood on the platform, clutching a small valise, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was indeed a large woman, with round cheeks and a substantial frame. But Thomas's first thought wasn't about her size, it was about her eyes. Clear blue and intelligent, they conveyed a quiet dignity that struck him immediately. "Miss Adams?" he called, stepping forward. Relief washed over her face. "Mr. Mitchell, you're exactly as you described yourself." Thomas realized she'd been afraid. He wouldn't come, or worse, would see her and leave without making himself known. The thought made something twist inside him. "Welcome to Elkhorn Falls," he said, taking her valise. "The wagon's just over here." Eleanor followed, head held high despite the stares of the townspeople. Mrs. Wilson whispered something to Mrs. Parker, both women covering their mouths as they laughed. Thomas felt a flush of anger rise in his throat. "Pay them no mind," he said quietly. "I'm quite accustomed to being the subject of whispers, Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "It ceased bothering me some time ago." But Thomas could see the slight trembling of her hand as she climbed into the wagon, the momentary faltering of her composure. It bothered her still, though she'd learned to hide it well. The ride to Whispering Pines was quiet at first. Eleanor looked out at the landscape, her expression softening as they left the town behind and entered the valley proper. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Your letters didn't do it justice." "Words rarely can," Thomas replied, finding himself pleased by her approval. "It changes with the seasons. The wildflowers will bloom soon." "I look forward to seeing that." She turned to face him directly. "Mr. Mitchell, I feel we should address the obvious. I am not what most men would have expected or desired. If now that we've met you wish to reconsider our arrangement, I would understand. I can find work in town until I earn enough for passage back east." Thomas studied her. In the afternoon light, he could see strands of auburn in her brown hair, pinned neatly beneath her hat. Her features were pleasant rather than beautiful, but her eyes held a depth of feeling that intrigued him. "Miss Adams, I'm a rancher. I value substance over appearance. A pretty face can't help birth calves at midnight, or keep a home when winter storms blow for days. I sought a partner with sense and character. Nothing I've seen today changes my mind on that account." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're very kind." "I'm not kind. I'm practical," Thomas corrected, though he smiled to soften his words. "And please call me Thomas. Then you must call me Eleanor." The ranch house came into view as they crested the last hill, a two-story structure of solid timber with a wide porch and windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Smoke curled from the chimney where Mrs. Hayes, who came to cook and clean twice weekly, had prepared dinner ahead of their arrival. "It's larger than I imagined," Eleanor said. "My father started it, but I added the upper floor and the east wing. There's a small library there I thought might interest you, given your mention of reading." Eleanor's face brightened. "A library, truly?" Thomas nodded, pleased by her reaction. "Nothing grand, but I try to get new books when I can." As they approached the house, a figure emerged from the barn, a girl of perhaps 16, dressed in trousers and a work shirt, her dark hair cut unfashionably short. "That's Lily, Jackson's daughter," Thomas explained. "She helps with the horses. Her mother passed away 5 years ago, and she's more comfortable around animals than people most days." Lily approached the wagon cautiously, her gaze fixed on Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Lily, this is Miss Adams," Thomas said. "She's come from Philadelphia to be my wife." Lily's eyes widened. "You're really staying? Pa said you'd probably..." Take one look at this place and catch the next train east. Lily, Thomas admonished, but Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. I find it quite lovely, Eleanor said, though I admit I'm more familiar with city streets than open ranges. I can teach you about horses if you want, Lily offered. They're easier to understand than people. I'd like that very much. Thomas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, conscious of the way her hand felt in his, soft but strong. Mrs. Hayes emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "So you've arrived at last," she said, looking Eleanor up and down with barely concealed disapproval. "Dinner's nearly ready. I've made up the guest room for Miss Adams." "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes," Thomas said firmly. "Miss Adams must be tired after her journey." Eleanor followed Mrs. Hayes inside, her back straight despite the older woman's obvious judgment. Thomas watched her go, feeling an unexpected surge of protectiveness. He'd known there would be talk. A bachelor his age suddenly sending for a bride would spark gossip regardless. But he hadn't anticipated how it would affect him. To see Eleanor as the target of such scrutiny. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, the house smelled of roast beef and fresh bread. The dining table was set for two, a small vase of early spring wildflowers at its center, Lily's doing, no doubt. The girl had a surprising eye for such touches. "Your home is lovely," Eleanor said, removing her hat and gloves. Her hair was coming loose from its pins after the long journey, soft tendrils framing her face. "It needs a woman's touch," Mrs. Hayes said, serving the meal. "Though I wasn't expecting—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Thomas cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hayes, thank you for preparing dinner. That will be all for today." The older woman pursed her lips but nodded. "I'll return on Monday as usual then. Good evening." After she left, an awkward silence descended. Eleanor sat across from Thomas, her hands folded in her lap. "I apologize for Mrs. Hayes," Thomas said finally. "She's been with the ranch since my father's time and sometimes forgets her place." "There's no need to apologize. I'm well aware of the impression I make." Eleanor's voice was calm, but Thomas could see the hurt beneath it. "I should have perhaps been more explicit in my letter. And I should have made it clearer that such things matter little to me." Thomas served her a portion of roast beef. "Tell me about Philadelphia. Your letter mentioned you were a teacher?" Eleanor's expression brightened. "Yes, for several years at a girls' school. I taught literature and mathematics, though I preferred the former." "And your parents? You cared for them, you said." A shadow crossed her face. "Mother suffered from consumption for many years. Father's heart weakened after a bout of influenza. I left teaching to care for them. After they passed, the school had filled my position, and I found prospects limited." Thomas understood what remained unsaid. A woman of Eleanor's size and age, with no family and dwindling funds, would have few options in Eastern society. "What about your family?" Eleanor asked. "You mentioned a sister in your letters." "Martha lives in Denver with her husband and 3 children. Our parents are long gone. Father from a fall from his horse when I was 20, mother from grief not long after. It's been just me here for nearly 15 years, though the ranch hands and their families are close enough to feel like kin sometimes." Eleanor nodded, sampling the food. "This is delicious. Mrs. Hayes has many faults, but cooking isn't one of them." Thomas hesitated. "I should tell you that we'll be expected at church tomorrow. The town will want to meet you." Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I see. We needn't go if you'd prefer more time to settle." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Better to face them directly than give them more reason to gossip. Besides, I've always found comfort in Sunday services." Thomas admired her courage. Many women would have asked for time, or perhaps avoided town altogether. "There's something else," he said, deciding honesty was the best approach. Traditionally, couples here marry within a month of the bride's arrival. The minister, Reverend Parker, will expect us to set a date. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Is that what you want, Thomas? To proceed as planned? He considered the question carefully. I believe we should take some time to become acquainted before making such a commitment. Perhaps we could tell Reverend Parker we'll speak with him in a few weeks' time. Relief flickered across Eleanor's face. I think that is very sensible. After dinner, Thomas showed Eleanor to her room, a comfortable chamber with a brass bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk beneath the window that overlooked the eastern pastures. My room is down the hall, he said. The bathroom is between us. I had indoor plumbing installed 2 years ago, a luxury out here, but worth every penny in winter. Eleanor smiled. A very welcome luxury after days on a train. I'll have hot water brought up. Take your time settling in. Breakfast is usually at 6, but tomorrow being Sunday, we can make it 7. Eleanor nodded. Thank you for your kindness, Thomas. It's not kindness, he said again. Just decency. Left alone, Eleanor unpacked her modest belongings. 3 dresses besides her travelling outfit, undergarments, a hairbrush and mirror, a small wooden box containing her mother's cameo brooch, and several books wrapped carefully in cloth. She placed them on the desk, running her fingers over their worn spines. Austen, Bronte, Dickens, and a slim volume of Tennyson's poetry. Outside her window, the Montana landscape stretched vast and wild, so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets. Her reflection appeared in the glass, a large woman with tired eyes, her hair escaping its pins. What was she doing here, in this strange place? Preparing to marry a man she barely knew. But what choice had she had, really? After her parents' deaths, the family home had been sold to pay their debts. Teaching positions were scarce, and those available went to younger, prettier women. Her cousins had made it clear that while she could stay with them temporarily, a more permanent arrangement would be burdensome. Thomas Mitchell's advertisement had seemed like providence, a chance at a new beginning in a place where perhaps her worth might be measured by more than her appearance. His letters had been straightforward but kind, his farm prosperous, his expectations reasonable. Now, having met him, Eleanor felt cautiously optimistic. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but his face was strong and honest. His manner, direct but not unkind. He hadn't flinched upon seeing her, hadn't shown disappointment or disgust as so many men had before. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lily stood there carrying a large copper can of steaming water. Mr. Mitchell asked me to bring this up, she said, entering to pour the water into the basin on the washstand. Did you really teach at a school? I did, Eleanor replied. Mathematics and literature. Lily's eyes brightened. Pa's teaching me figures for the ranch accounts, but I'm better with words. Do you think... Might you have time to help me with my reading sometimes? Mrs. Hayes says it's foolish for a girl to waste time on books, but Pa says education never hurts. Your father sounds like a wise man, Eleanor said, smiling. I'd be delighted to help you. Really? Lily beamed. That's swell. I mean, that's very kind of you, ma'am. Eleanor, please. After Lily left, Eleanor prepared for bed, washing away the grime of travel and changing into her nightgown. The bed was comfortable, the sheets fresh and clean. Through the open window came the sound of night birds and the distant lowing of cattle, unfamiliar but somehow soothing. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. The church service would be her introduction to Elkhorn Falls society, such as it was. There would be stares, whispers, judgments. Eleanor had endured such things all her life, from schoolyard taunts to the cruel dismissals of adulthood. She had developed a protective shell of dignity, but each barb still found its mark. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor thought of Thomas. Mitchell's steady gaze, how he'd looked at her face rather than her figure, how he defended her without making a show of it. Perhaps here, in this wild country where survival depended on more than appearances, she might finally find a place to belong. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the curtains. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best dress, a navy blue garment with modest lace at the collar. She pinned her mother's cameo at her throat and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style. When she descended the stairs, Thomas was waiting in the front room, dressed in a clean black suit. He looked up at her approach, his expression warming. "You look very nice," he said, the simple compliment clearly sincere. "As do you," Eleanor replied, feeling a flutter of unexpected nervousness. "There's coffee and biscuits in the kitchen if you're hungry." They ate a quick breakfast before setting out in the wagon. The spring morning was crisp, but promised warmth later. As they approached town, Eleanor straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for what was to come. The Elkhorn Falls Church was a white clapboard building with a tall steeple, surrounded by wagons and horses as families gathered for the Sunday service. Conversations hushed as Thomas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, curious eyes following their progress toward the church steps. Reverend Parker greeted them at the door, a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, how good to see you, and this must be Miss Adams." "A pleasure to meet you, Reverend," Eleanor said, extending her hand. "Indeed, we've all been most curious about Mr. Mitchell's intended." The minister's gaze swept over her, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Please come in, we're about to begin." Inside, Thomas led Eleanor to a pew near the back, but they might as well have sat at the altar for all the attention they received. Heads turned, whispers buzzed. Mrs. Wilson, the doctor's wife Eleanor had seen at the station, leaned close to her companion, both women glancing back with barely concealed surprise. "Guess Mitchell was desperate after all," a male voice murmured from somewhere behind them, just loud enough to be heard. Thomas's jaw tightened, but Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's all right," she whispered. "This is nothing new." The service began. Reverend Parker's sermon, focusing pointedly on the virtues of physical beauty as a reflection of spiritual purity, with numerous references to gluttony and self-control. By the time the final hymn was sung, Eleanor's face burned with humiliation, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. As they filed out, the congregation seemed to form a gauntlet of curiosity and judgment. Mrs. Parker, the minister's wife, approached with a thin smile. "Miss Adams, welcome to Elkhorn Falls. How brave of you to travel so far to meet Mr. Mitchell." "Thank you," Eleanor replied evenly. "Everyone has been most interesting. We're having a quilting circle on Tuesday at my home. Perhaps you'd care to join us. The ladies are eager to become acquainted." Eleanor recognized the invitation for what it was, an opportunity for the town women to scrutinize and evaluate her more thoroughly. Still, avoiding them would only fuel more gossip. "I'd be delighted," she said, forcing a smile. Thomas's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. Several of the men exchanged knowing looks. "Mitchell," one called, a heavy-set rancher with a florid face. "Didn't realize you were in such a rush to marry. Could have introduced you to my niece from Helena if you'd mentioned it." "I'm quite satisfied with my choice, Carson," Thomas replied coldly. As they walked back to the wagon, the whispers followed. Eleanor kept her head high, though each step felt heavier than the last. Only when they were on the road back to Whispering Pines did she allow her shoulders to slump slightly. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "They're small-minded people." "They're no different from people anywhere," Eleanor replied. "I've faced worse." Thomas glanced at her. "You shouldn't have to." The simple statement, spoken with such conviction, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to show weakness. "Perhaps not," she said, "but the world is what it is." Thomas shook his head. "Not always. Not here." He hesitated. "Eleanor, I want you to know something. I didn't bring you here out of desperation or pity. I brought you here because your letters showed intelligence and character. Now that I've met you, I'm even more convinced of those qualities." Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but finding none. "Thank you, Thomas. That means a great deal." As they approached the ranch, Thomas cleared his throat. I wondered if you might like to see more of the property this afternoon. The east pasture is particularly nice this time of year." Eleanor smiled genuinely this time. "I'd like that very much." The wagon continued toward Whispering Pines, leaving the town and its judgments behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, and the possibility of something neither had dared hope for: understanding, respect, and perhaps, in time, something deeper still. The Sunday morning after the dance dawned bright and clear. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting her hat with trembling fingers. Today, she and Thomas would announce their engagement to the town, a prospect that filled her with both joy and trepidation. A knock at the door revealed Thomas, already dressed, in his Sunday best. "Ready?" he asked, his steady gaze offering reassurance. "As I'll ever be," Eleanor replied with a small smile, "though I suspect Mrs. Wilson may require smelling salts when we share our news." Thomas chuckled, offering his arm. "Let her swoon. It would liven up the service." The ride to town was filled with comfortable conversation. Eleanor marveled at how quickly Thomas had become a fixture in her life, how natural it felt to share her thoughts with him. When they'd first met scarcely a month ago, she'd been a desperate woman seeking security. Now she found herself genuinely looking forward to building a life with this quiet, honorable man. "Reverend Parker will want to discuss dates," Thomas said as they approached the church. "I was thinking perhaps mid-June. That would give us time to prepare properly." "June would be lovely," Eleanor agreed, imagining wildflowers in bloom across the valley. "Nothing elaborate, though." "No," Thomas agreed. "Just friends and neighbors, and perhaps your cousin from Philadelphia. Martha, was it?" Eleanor's heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. "I'd like that very much, though I'm not certain she'd make the journey." "We could assist with her travel expenses," Thomas suggested. "If you wish, I mean." These small considerations, recognizing her desire for family at her wedding, offering to help make it possible, revealed the depth of Thomas's character. He might not speak of love in flowery terms, but his actions demonstrated genuine care. The church hummed with conversation as they entered. Eyes immediately turned their way, curious and speculative. Mrs. Hayes sniffed disapprovingly, while Mrs. Wilson leaned to whisper something to her husband. Sarah Johnson offered a friendly wave. From her pew, after the service, Thomas approached Reverend Parker, Eleanor at his side. "Reverend, we'd like to speak with you about setting a wedding date." The minister's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. You've made your decision, then?" "We have," Thomas said firmly. "Miss Adams has agreed to become my wife." "I see." Reverend Parker's gaze flicked over Eleanor, his expression inscrutable. "Perhaps you'd join me in my study to discuss the details?" In the small room adjacent to the church, the minister seated himself behind a desk piled with papers. "Marriage is a sacred commitment before God, Mr. Mitchell, not a decision to be made lightly." "We understand that, Reverend," Thomas replied. "And you, Miss Adams, you're certain this is what you want? A life here, so far from everything familiar?" "I am," Eleanor said simply. "Thomas and I may have met through unconventional means, but we've grown to respect and value each other deeply." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Very well. When did you have that in mind?" "June 15th, Thomas answered. "Here at the church, with a small celebration afterward at Whispering Pines." "That can be arranged." Reverend Parker made a note in his calendar. You'll need to attend marriage preparation sessions, of course. 3 meetings to discuss the responsibilities and expectations of Christian matrimony. As they left the study, the news had already begun spreading through the congregation, still lingering outside. Mrs. Wilson approached, her face a mask of polite surprise. So the rumors are true? You're actually going through with this arrangement? It's no longer an arrangement, Mrs. Wilson, Thomas said coolly. It's an engagement between 2 people who have chosen each other. How progressive of you. Thomas, she replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but a compliment. I do hope you know what you're doing. Better than most, he stated firmly, placing a protective hand at the small of Eleanor's back. The walk back to their wagon became something of a gauntlet as various townspeople approached, with congratulations that ranged from genuinely warm to thinly veiled disapproval. By the time they reached the edge of town, Eleanor's composure was beginning to fray. Well, she said as they drove away, that was certainly illuminating. Thomas's knuckles were white on the reins. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Their behavior was inexcusable. Not entirely unexpected, though, she sighed. Some people find it difficult to accept anything that challenges their notions of how the world should be. He glanced at her. You're remarkably understanding of people who don't deserve it. Understanding doesn't mean acceptance, Eleanor clarified. I simply find it wastes less energy to recognize their limitations than to rail against them. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're wiser than I am. I wanted to tell Mrs. Wilson exactly what I thought of her insinuations. And what did you think? Eleanor asked, curious despite herself. That she's a small-minded woman who wouldn't recognize true quality if it sat beside her in church every Sunday, Thomas said bluntly. Then his expression softened. And that I'm fortunate beyond measure that you chose to answer my advertisement. The weeks following their announcement brought both challenges and unexpected joys. News of their engagement circulated through the county, drawing various reactions. Several neighboring ranchers and their wives made a point of visiting Whispering Pines, ostensibly to welcome Eleanor, but clearly to satisfy their curiosity. Mrs. Hayes, presented with the certainty that Eleanor would become the permanent mistress of the house, grew increasingly difficult. Her passive resistance, misplaced items, meals prepared exactly opposite to Eleanor's stated preferences, became a daily battle of wills. You needn't keep her on, Thomas offered one evening after a particularly trying dinner of overcooked beef and undercooked potatoes. We could find someone else. No, Eleanor decided after consideration. Mrs. Hayes has been part of this home for many years. Change is difficult for some people. I believe she may come around eventually. May brought warmer weather and the wildflowers Thomas had promised. Eleanor spent mornings working in the small kitchen garden she'd established, afternoons reading, or helping Lily improve her literature skills, and evenings on the porch with Thomas, talking as twilight deepened. During these conversations, she learned about his childhood on the struggling homestead, how he'd built the ranch through sheer determination after his parents' deaths. He, in turn, discovered her love of poetry, her dreams of one day writing stories of her own, and the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of subtle and overt cruelty. People can be cruel when they don't understand, she explained. One evening, my size made me an easy target from childhood onward. Girls mocked me, boys made crude jokes, and adults spoke about such a shame when they thought I couldn't hear. Thomas's expression darkened. It must have been painful. It was, Eleanor admitted. Still is, sometimes. But it also taught me to value what lies beneath appearances, to recognize kindness when it's offered sincerely. Like your kindness to Lily, Thomas observed. She idolizes you, you know. Told Jackson yesterday she wants to be a teacher like Miss Eleanor when she grows up. Eleanor smiled, genuinely touched. She's a bright girl. With the right encouragement, she could do anything she sets her mind to. Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. That's what I admire about you, Eleanor. You see possibilities where others see limitations. These quiet moments of connection grew more frequent as their wedding approached. Though Thomas maintained a respectful distance, never pushing for physical intimacy beyond an occasional kiss, Eleanor sensed a deepening of feeling between them. What had begun as mutual respect was blossoming into something warmer, something that made her heart quicken when he entered a room. In early June, an unexpected letter arrived from Philadelphia. Eleanor's cousin Martha wrote that she would indeed attend the wedding, bringing her husband and eldest daughter. The news brought Eleanor both joy and anxiety. Martha had always been kind, but her husband Gregory was known for his blunt assessments and social ambitions. "Will their visit cause you distress?" Thomas asked when she shared the news. "Not distress exactly," Eleanor replied carefully, "but Gregory has always been conscious of appearances. He may find Elkhorn Falls lacking in sophistication." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll simply have to show him that Western hospitality compensates for any perceived deficiencies." A week before the wedding, Eleanor visited town with Sarah Johnson to finalize arrangements for the small celebration they would host at Whispering Pines. As they left the general store, arms full of packages, Melissa Carson approached, accompanied by her father, Miss Adams. She greeted with false warmth. "Such industry! One might think you were preparing for a genuine society wedding rather than a practical arrangement." Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah interjected, "It will be the most joyful wedding Elkhorn Falls has seen in years. The entire valley is talking about it." Mr. Carson chuckled. Mitchell certainly caused a stir with his choice. But then he was always unconventional. Unconventional, Eleanor inquired mildly, for recognizing that a wife should be more than merely decorative. Carson's amusement faded. "For throwing away the chance to merge two of the finest properties in the county. My Melissa would have brought almost 1,000 acres to that marriage." "Dad!" Melissa hissed, her cheeks flaming. "It's true," Carson continued. "Instead, he chooses a woman with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and Eastern habits that won't serve her well out here." Eleanor felt Sarah stiffen beside her, but she placed a calming hand on her friend's arm. "Mr. Carson, I may not bring land or cattle to my marriage, but I assure you I bring qualities Thomas values far more: loyalty, intelligence, and the ability to recognize a good man when I find one." She turned to Melissa, whose expression wavered between embarrassment and anger. "I believe you and I might have become friends under different circumstances, Miss Carson. Perhaps someday we still might." With that, Eleanor walked away, head high. Despite the trembling in her limbs, Sarah hurried to keep pace. "That was masterful," she whispered once they were out of earshot. "Did you see Melissa's face?" "I took no pleasure in it," Eleanor sighed. "She's not the villain in this story. Merely a young woman raised to believe her worth lies in her appearance and family connections." Sarah shook her head in wonder. "You're either a saint or the best actress I've ever encountered." "Neither," Eleanor laughed. "Simply a woman who's known enough unkindness to recognize when others lash out from pain rather than malice." 3 days before the wedding, Martha and her family arrived on the afternoon train. Eleanor waited at the station with Thomas, anxious about this collision of her past and future. Martha emerged first, a slender woman with features similar to Eleanor's, though arranged in more conventional proportions. She rushed forward with a glad cry, embracing her cousin tightly. "Eleanor, look at you, positively glowing. The West agrees with you, it seems." Gregory followed more sedately, a tall man with fashionable side whiskers and an assessing gaze. Beside him stood their daughter Amelia, a pretty girl of 17, who stared openly at the dusty street and roughly dressed townspeople. "Cousin." "Oh, Gregory," Eleanor greeted him. "Thank you for coming all this way. And, Amelia, how you've grown." Gregory nodded stiffly, his eyes moving to Thomas. "This must be your fiancé." "Thomas Mitchell." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to Elkhorn Falls." The handshake was brief, Gregory's expression making clear his assessment of both Thomas and the town. "Quite a change from Philadelphia, Eleanor. I confess I'm surprised you've adapted so readily. Perhaps you'll understand better once you've seen Whispering Pines," Eleanor suggested diplomatically. The ride to the ranch was filled with Martha's chatter about Philadelphia society and Amelia's increasingly horrified questions about life in Montana Territory. "But where do you shop? There can't possibly be a proper dressmaker in that tiny town." "We order from catalogs for special items," Eleanor explained, "though Mrs. Johnson at the general store carries a surprising selection of fabrics and notions." "And the society?" Gregory inquired. "I presume it's rather limited," Thomas answered before Eleanor could. "We may lack opera houses and museums, Mr. Wharton, but you'll find the people here possess character and resilience that would impress even the most cultured Easterner, if they're willing to look beyond surface appearances." The pointed comment wasn't lost on Gregory, who fell into contemplative silence. As they crested the final rise before the ranch, the valley spread before them in late afternoon splendor. Even Gregory couldn't suppress a murmur of appreciation at the sight of Whispering Pines nestled among the trees, cattle grazing in verdant pastures. "It's magnificent," Martha breathed. "Eleanor, you never said it was so beautiful." "Words rarely do it justice," Eleanor replied, exchanging a small smile with Thomas. Dinner that evening was a testament to Eleanor's growing skill as a hostess. Despite Mrs. Hayes's continued resistance, the meal was excellent. The dining room, arranged to showcase the home at its best. Lily had brought wildflowers to adorn the table, and Jackson joined them, his natural charm helping to smooth awkward moments in conversation. Later, when the men had retired to Thomas's study for brandy, Martha pulled Eleanor aside in the parlor. "He's a good man, your Thomas," she said. "I can see it in how he looks at you." "How does he look at me?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Martha smiled. "Like you're a treasure he never expected to find. Gregory never looked at me that way, even when we were courting." A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest. "We've grown fond of each other." "Fond?" Martha laughed lightly. "My dear, that man is half in love with you already. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you feel the same." Eleanor didn't deny it. Something had blossomed between her and Thomas. Something that went beyond the practical arrangement they'd initially agreed upon. Whether it was love in the romantic sense, she couldn't say with certainty, but it held the promise of becoming so. "Gregory thinks I've made a terrible mistake," she said. "Instead, coming all this way to marry a stranger." "Gregory thinks anything outside Philadelphia society is a mistake," Martha replied dryly. "But I see how happy you are here, how comfortable in your own skin. When you left, you were like a flower wilting in shadow. Now you've bloomed." The observation startled Eleanor. She hadn't considered how she might appear to someone who knew her before. Had she truly changed so much in just a few months? The day before the wedding, disaster struck. Eleanor was helping Martha and Amelia settle into the guest rooms when Mrs. Hayes appeared, her expression even more sour than usual. "Mr. Mitchell wants to see you," she announced. "In the barn. Something about the wedding preparations." Eleanor excused herself and hurried outside. As she approached the barn, she heard raised voices. Thomas and Jackson engaged in heated discussion. Can't just ignore it, Jackson was saying. Half the herd could be affected by now. We don't know that for certain, Thomas argued. It could be isolated cases. What's happened? Eleanor asked, stepping inside. Both men turned, surprise and concern evident on their faces. Thomas recovered first. Eleanor, I didn't send for you. Mrs. Hayes said you wanted to see me. Understanding dawned. She lied. She shouldn't have involved you, Thomas said, his expression grim. We have a situation with the cattle. Several are showing signs of illness. How serious is it? Eleanor asked. Jackson ran a hand through his greying hair. Could be very. If it's what I think it is, we could lose a significant portion of the herd. The implications were clear. The cattle represented not just Thomas's livelihood, but the culmination of years of work. A major loss could devastate the ranch financially. What can be done? She pressed. We need to separate the healthy animals from the sick ones immediately, Thomas explained. Then ride to neighboring ranches to warn them if this spreads across the valley. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What about the wedding? Eleanor asked quietly. Thomas's expression tightened. I don't know, Eleanor, if we need to quarantine the ranch. The unspoken possibility hung in the air. Their wedding might need to be postponed, perhaps indefinitely, depending on the severity of the outbreak. Tell me what I can do to help, Eleanor said firmly. Thomas shook his head. This isn't your concern. It's a ranch business. If I'm to be your wife tomorrow, it is very much my concern, Eleanor countered. This ranch will be my home, these people and my family. I won't stand idle while you face this alone. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Surprise-giving. Way to a deeper emotion she couldn't quite name. You truly mean that? Of course I do, Eleanor replied. Now what needs to be done? The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor sent Martha to inform Reverend Parker of the situation, while she organized supplies and food for the men who would work through the night. Lily was dispatched to town with messages for neighboring ranchers, and even Amelia was enlisted to help in the kitchen, her initial reluctance giving way to determined effort. Gregory watched these developments with growing bewilderment. Surely this isn't women's work, he protested, as Eleanor prepared to bring food to the men in the far pasture. There is no men's or women's work in a crisis, Eleanor replied firmly. Only necessary work. By midnight, they had separated the visibly ill cattle from the rest of the herd. Thomas returned to the house briefly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. You should rest, Eleanor told him, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. There's too much to do, he argued, though he sank gratefully into a chair. The men can manage for an hour while you gather your strength, she insisted. You're no use to anyone if you collapse. Thomas looked up at her, his expression unguarded in his fatigue. You're remarkable, Eleanor Adams. Anyone else would be bemoaning their ruined wedding day. The wedding can wait, she said simply. This, the ranch, the cattle, the livelihood of everyone here, this is what matters now. Thomas caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his exhaustion. I love you, he said quietly. I should have said it before, but I wasn't certain until now. Watching you today, seeing how you've taken on this challenge without hesitation, I know with absolute certainty that I love you, Eleanor Adams. The declaration, so unexpected in the midst of the crisis, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. She searched his face, finding only sincerity in his tired eyes. I love you too, she whispered, the truth of it washing through her with surprising force. I think perhaps I have for some time. Thomas pulled her gently toward him, his kiss conveying everything words could not, gratitude, admiration, and a depth of feeling that transcended their original practical arrangement. When they parted, Eleanor smiled softly. Rest now. Wedding or no wedding, we have a ranch to save. As dawn broke over Whispering Pines, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the eastern sky lighten from indigo to pale gold. Behind her, the house was quiet, everyone having finally succumbed to exhaustion. In the small hours of the morning, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider approached from town, Reverend Parker himself, looking decidedly out of place on horseback. "Miss Adams," he called, dismounting stiffly. "I came as soon as I could. How stands the situation?" "Better than we feared," Eleanor replied. "The illness appears confined to one section of the herd. With proper care, Thomas believes most will recover." The minister nodded gravely. "A blessing, then. And the wedding?" "I understand it must be postponed." Eleanor hesitated. "That was our assumption, yes." "A pity. The town was quite looking forward to the event, despite initial reservations." Something in his tone made Eleanor look at him more closely. "Reverend Parker, may I speak frankly?" "Of course. When I first arrived in Elkhorn Falls, you and many others judged me harshly based solely on my appearance. You questioned my suitability as Thomas's wife, doubted the genuineness of our attachment." The minister had the grace to look discomfited. "Perhaps some skepticism was expressed. More than some," Eleanor corrected gently. "Yet here I stand, having thrown myself fully into the life of this ranch, facing its challenges alongside the man I've come to love deeply. I wonder if perhaps you might reconsider your judgment." Reverend Parker studied her for a long moment. "Miss Adams, I am not too proud to admit when I've been mistaken. Your actions during this crisis speak to a character of remarkable strength and devotion. Thomas Mitchell is fortunate indeed to have found you." "As I am to have found him," Eleanor replied simply. The Reverend straightened, a new resolve in his bearing. "In light of the circumstances, I would like to make an offer. If Mr. Mitchell agrees, I am prepared to perform a small ceremony here at the ranch today. Nothing elaborate, just family and those ranch hands who can be spared. The formal celebration can wait until the crisis has passed." Eleanor's heart swelled with unexpected joy. "You would do that?" "It seems the least I can do," he said, "to remedy my earlier misjudgment." When Thomas emerged from the house an hour later, Eleanor shared the Reverend's proposal. His face, haggard from the night's labor, brightened considerably. "Today? You still want to marry today despite everything?" "More than ever," Eleanor assured him. "If this crisis has shown me anything, it's that we face life better together than apart." By noon, a small gathering had assembled in the front yard of Whispering Pines. Martha had worked wonders with limited resources, arranging wildflowers from the meadow in simple bouquets. Lily had rushed to retrieve Eleanor's wedding dress from where it hung in the spare room, and even Mrs. Hayes had set aside her disapproval long enough to prepare a modest wedding breakfast. Most surprising was Gregory's transformation. After witnessing Eleanor's capable handling of the crisis, his attitude had shifted from condescension to something approaching respect. "You've found your place in the world, cousin," he told her as he prepared to walk her down the makeshift aisle. "It's not what any of us expected, but it suits you remarkably well." "Thank you, Gregory," Eleanor replied, genuinely touched by his acknowledgement. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Thomas, freshly washed and changed despite the morning's continued work with the cattle, watched Eleanor approach with undisguised wonder. When they joined hands before Reverend Parker, the connection between them was palpable. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying across the yard to the small assembly of family, friends, and weary ranch hands. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have demonstrated through word and deed the true meaning of partnership and devotion." As they exchanged vows, Eleanor thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a lonely spinster in Philadelphia to a woman standing proudly beside the man she loved, surrounded by people who had come to respect her for qualities That had nothing to do with her appearance. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Parker declared. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Thomas kissed her then, a promise sealed before witnesses. When they turned to face their small gathering, Eleanor was startled to see Mrs. Hayes dabbing surreptitiously at her eyes. The celebration that followed was modest. Coffee and cake on the porch, congratulations from those present, and a quick return to the necessary work of tending the sick cattle. Yet it possessed a warmth and sincerity that no elaborate Philadelphia society wedding could have matched. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Eleanor found Thomas by the corral, checking on a particularly valuable bull that had shown early symptoms of the illness. "Husband," she said, testing the word on her tongue. He turned, his smile chasing away the fatigue in his features. "Wife," he replied, drawing her close. "Are you disappointed? About the wedding, I mean." Eleanor shook her head. "It was perfect in all the ways that matter. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I suspect we'll be the talk of Elkhorn Falls for months to come, not for the expected reasons, but because we chose to marry in the midst of a crisis rather than delay." "Let them talk," Thomas said, his arms tightening around her. "I have everything I need right here." As the sun set over Whispering Pines, casting long golden rays across the valley, Eleanor Adams Mitchell stood beside her husband, facing whatever challenges lay ahead with the certainty that she had finally, truly been seen. Not for her size, but for the beauty of her spirit, the strength of her character, and the capacity of her heart. The weeks following Thomas and Eleanor's unexpected wedding day brought both challenges and triumphs to Whispering Pines. The cattle illness, while serious, proved less devastating than initially feared. With diligent care and Thomas's experience management, they lost only 12 animals from the herd, a painful but survivable blow to the ranch's finances. Eleanor's Philadelphia relatives departed a week after the ceremony, Gregory Wharton significantly more impressed than when he'd arrived. "You've chosen well, Mitchell," he told Thomas the morning of their departure. "She may not be what society considers ideal, but Eleanor has qualities worth far more than conventional beauty." "I'm well aware," Thomas replied simply. Martha embraced. Her cousin tearfully, "Write to me, Eleanor. Tell me everything. And perhaps next summer we might visit again when the ranch isn't in crisis." "I'd like that," Eleanor said, surprised by how much she would miss her cousin's company. As the train pulled away from Elkhorn Falls Station, Eleanor felt a momentary pang of connection to her old life slipping away. Then Thomas's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Mitchell?" The name still sounded new and wonderful. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell, I believe I am." Life settled into a rhythm as summer progressed. Eleanor established herself firmly as mistress of Whispering Pines, gradually winning over even Mrs. Hayes with consistent kindness and quiet competence. The housekeeper's resistance gave way by degrees, first in small concessions, like preparing meals to Eleanor's preferences, then in grudging respect, as Eleanor mastered the challenges of managing a ranch household. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Hayes admitted one day in late July, as they preserved jars of wild raspberries Eleanor had gathered from the meadow. "When Mr. Mitchell said he'd sent for a bride from back east, I thought we'd get some useless hothouse flower who'd flee at the first winter snow." "I may be from Philadelphia, Mrs. Hayes, but I'm hardly delicate," Eleanor replied, managing to keep any hint of sarcasm from her voice. The older woman snorted. "No, you're not, and that's to your credit." From Mrs. Hayes, this constituted high praise indeed. Thomas and Eleanor's relationship deepened as summer warmth gave way to autumn's golden hues. Their practical partnership had blossomed into genuine love, expressed more often in shared moments than grand declarations. Thomas wasn't a man of flowery words, but Eleanor treasured his steady affection and the quiet ways he demonstrated his regard. Each morning, he brought her wildflowers for the breakfast table. Each evening, they sat together on the porch, discussing the day's events as twilight painted the valley in soft purple shadows. At night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they discovered each other with tenderness and growing passion. In town, attitudes toward Eleanor evolved gradually. What had begun as mockery and skepticism shifted toward reluctant acceptance as she proved herself a capable rancher's wife. Sarah Johnson remained her steadfast friend, but other women began to include Eleanor in community activities. Even Mrs. Wilson thawed slightly after Eleanor organized a successful fundraiser for new hymnals at the church. "They're starting to see what I saw from the beginning," Thomas commented after church one Sunday in September, when 3 different families had invited them to Sunday dinner. "And what was that?" Eleanor asked. "A woman of substance," he replied, his simple assessment meaning more to Eleanor than volumes of poetry. Autumn brought the cattle drive, Thomas's first extended absence since their marriage. For 8 days, he and most of the ranch hands would move the herd to the railhead 30 miles away, leaving Eleanor to manage Whispering Pines with only Lily and Jackson's younger son Michael for assistance. "Are you certain you'll be all right?" Thomas asked the night before his departure, concern evident in his expression. Eleanor smiled, touched by his worry. "I managed a household of 5 servants in Philadelphia and nursed both my parents through extended illnesses. I believe I can handle a ranch for a week." "Of course you can," Thomas agreed, drawing her into his arms. "I'll miss you terribly." "I will you," she whispered against his chest. "Be safe." The separation proved more difficult than Eleanor had anticipated. She had grown accustomed to Thomas's steady presence, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his body beside hers at night. The house seemed emptier without him, the days longer. She filled the hours with productivity, deep cleaning rooms long, neglected, organizing Thomas's account books into a more efficient system, and spending afternoons with Lily, whose reading had improved remarkably under Eleanor's tutelage. On the 4th day of Thomas's absence, Eleanor was hanging laundry in the yard when she noticed a rider approaching, Reverend Parker, his expression grim. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called, dismounting stiffly. "I'm afraid I bring troubling news." Eleanor's heart seized. "Thomas, has something happened to the drive?" "No, no," the minister hastened to assure her. "Nothing like that. It's about Mrs. Hayes. She was found unconscious in her cottage this morning. Dr. Wilson believes she suffered an apoplexy." Relief at Thomas's safety gave way to concern for the housekeeper. "How serious is it?" "Quite grave, I'm afraid. She has no family in the area, as you know. The doctor thought you should be informed, as her employer." Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Please tell Dr. Wilson I'll come immediately. I'll just need a moment to secure things." Here, within half an hour, Eleanor was driving the wagon toward town, Lily beside her. Mrs. Hayes lived in a small cottage near the church, provided years ago by Thomas's father in recognition of her long service to the family. Dr. Wilson met them at the door, his expression neutral despite his wife's well-known disapproval of Eleanor. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming so promptly." "How is she?" Eleanor asked, stepping inside the meticulously kept cottage. "Poor," the doctor admitted. "The right side of her body is paralyzed. She's conscious now, but unable to speak clearly. At her age, recovery is uncertain." Eleanor nodded gravely. "May I see her?" Mrs. Hayes lay in a narrow bed, her normally stern face slack on one side, her right arm limp atop the coverlet. Her left eye tracked Eleanor's approach, recognition and something like shame flickering in her gaze. "Mrs. Hayes," Eleanor said gently, taking the older woman's left hand, "I've come to help." The housekeeper made a strangled sound, clearly frustrated by her inability to speak. "Don't tax yourself," Eleanor soothed. "Just rest now. Dr. Wilson, what care will she require?" "Round-the-clock attention for at least a week," he replied. "Someone to help her with basic needs, try to get her to take liquids, prevent bed sores. If she survives this initial period, she may regain some function, though likely never her full capabilities." Eleanor considered the situation. Mrs. Hayes had no family, limited savings, and her cottage was too small to accommodate a nurse, even if they could find one in Elkhorn Falls. "She'll come to Whispering Pines," Eleanor decided. "We have space to care for her properly." Dr. Wilson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's very generous, Mrs. Mitchell, especially given Mrs. Hayes's well-known attitude toward you." "She's served our family faithfully for decades," Eleanor replied simply. "We won't abandon her now." Moving Mrs. Hayes required careful planning. Eleanor arranged for the ranch wagon to be fitted with a mattress and blankets. Lily was dispatched to prepare the downstairs guest room at Whispering Pines, while Eleanor gathered Mrs. Hayes's essential belongings. As they settled the semi-conscious woman for the journey, Mrs. Wilson appeared at the cottage door, her perpetual expression of disapproval momentarily replaced by uncertainty. "Mrs. Mitchell," she began stiffly, that is, the Ladies' Aid Society would be willing to arrange a rotation of care for Mrs. Hayes. There's no need for you to assume such a burden." Eleanor recognized the offer for what it was. Part genuine concern for Mrs. Hayes, part disbelief that Eleanor would willingly care for someone who had treated her with such consistent hostility. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, but Mrs. Hayes will be more comfortable at Whispering Pines, where she's spent most of her life. Of course, visitors from the Ladies' Aid would be most welcome." Mrs. Wilson studied Eleanor's face, searching perhaps for hidden motives and finding none. "Very well. I shall call tomorrow to see what assistance might be needed." The journey to the ranch was slow and careful over rutted roads. By the time they arrived, Mrs. Hayes had drifted into a fitful sleep. Michael helped carry her to the prepared room, while Eleanor mixed beef broth with the medicinal powders Dr. Wilson had provided. For the next 3 days, Eleanor barely left Mrs. Hayes's side, coaxing small amounts of liquid between the older woman's lips, turning her to prevent bed sores, and speaking to her in a gentle, matter-of-fact manner about ranch happenings. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as Eleanor was reading aloud from one of her poetry books, Mrs. Hayes's left hand suddenly gripped hers with surprising strength. "Thus," the housekeeper slurred, struggling to form words. "This? Why?" Eleanor understood the question immediately. "Why am I caring for you?" "Because it's the right thing to do, Mrs. Hayes. Because everyone deserves kindness, especially in their most vulnerable moments." Tears leaked from the corner of Mrs. Hayes's good eye. With visible effort, she forced out more words. "Was wrong about you." The simple admission, so difficult for the proud woman to make, touched Eleanor deeply. "We were both judging too quickly, I think. Rest now. Thomas will be back tomorrow, and we want you strong enough to scold him for tracking mud into your clean kitchen." A ghost of a smile flickered across Mrs. Hayes's face before she drifted back to sleep. True to his word, Thomas returned the following day, rushing into the house with barely a greeting for Lily or Michael. "Eleanor," he called, voice tight with worry. "In here," she replied from Mrs. Hayes's sick room. Thomas appeared in the doorway, trail dust still coating his clothes, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. His expression softened with relief at the sight of Eleanor, then grew concerned again as he took in Mrs. Hayes's condition. "Reverend Parker found us on the trail," he explained. "Told me what happened. How is she?" "Improving, I think," Eleanor said, rising to embrace her husband despite his trail-worn state. "She's managing a few words now and taking liquids more easily." Thomas held her tightly for a moment, then stepped back to study her face. "And you? You look exhausted." "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. Sarah Johnson and Mrs. Wilson have both been helping. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mrs. Wilson voluntarily entered our home? Remarkable, isn't it? Eleanor smiled. Adversity makes strange bedfellows, it seems. Later that evening, after Thomas had bathed and eaten, they sat together on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders as stars appeared in the deepening twilight. "I'm proud of you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Not many would have shown such kindness to someone who treated them as Mrs. Hayes treated you." Eleanor leaned against his solid warmth. "When I first came here, everyone judged me by my appearance. I know how it feels to be dismissed without consideration of one's true character. I wouldn't do the same to Mrs. Hayes or anyone else." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're teaching this whole town something about dignity and grace." "Not intentionally," Eleanor demurred. "I'm simply trying to live by my own principles." "That's precisely why it's so effective," Thomas observed. "Your actions speak far louder than any sermon." Mrs. Hayes remained at Whispering Pines through the autumn, gradually regaining some strength, though never full function of her right side. Eleanor arranged for the cottage in town to be rented to a young couple from a neighboring ranch, with the proceeds going toward Mrs. Hayes's care. The housekeeper's attitude underwent a transformation as profound as her physical condition. The bitterness and resentment that had characterized her interactions with Eleanor gave way to grudging respect, then genuine appreciation. By November, she had become an unlikely ally, instructing Eleanor in the particulars of ranch management from her wheelchair in the kitchen. "The first winter's always the hardest," Mrs. Hayes warned, as they prepared preserves for the coming cold months. "Isolation plays tricks on the mind when snow blocks the roads for weeks at a time." Eleanor nodded, taking the advice seriously. "What do you suggest?" "Books, for one thing. Music, if you play an instrument. And projects, quilting, mending, anything to keep the hands busy and the mind engaged." "Perhaps we could work on a quilt together," Eleanor suggested. "I'm still learning, but with your guidance." Mrs. Hayes's expression softened. "I'd like that, Mrs. Mitchell. I would indeed." As winter approached, Eleanor found herself experiencing unexpected fatigue and occasional morning nausea. She kept these symptoms to herself at first, not wanting to worry Thomas unnecessarily. But as weeks passed and her condition became more apparent, she could no longer deny the likely cause. One evening in early December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Eleanor took Thomas's hand. "I believe we should prepare the small bedroom next to ours," she said quietly. "We'll need it by summer." Thomas looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Eleanor, are you certain?" She nodded, a mixture of joy and apprehension fluttering in her chest. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting a child in late June." Thomas's face transformed with wonder and delight. He gathered Eleanor into his arms, holding her as though she were made of precious glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the question. Of course he was pleased. Children were the expected outcome of marriage. Yet some part of her had worried that her size might make the prospect of bearing his child less appealing. Thomas drew back to look directly into her eyes. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it. I'm overjoyed, Eleanor. A child created from our love is the greatest gift I could imagine." His sincerity banished her insecurities. This was Thomas, after all, the man who had seen beyond her appearance from the very beginning, who valued her for qualities society often overlooked. News of Eleanor's pregnancy spread quickly through Elkhorn Falls, generating reactions that reflected the town's evolving attitude toward her. Sarah Johnson was unreservedly delighted, immediately beginning work on a baby blanket. Mrs. Wilson offered qualified congratulations along with unsolicited advice on proper prenatal care. Melissa Carson, recently engaged to a banker from Helena, sent a surprisingly gracious note wishing Eleanor good health. Winter descended on Whispering Pines with a ferocity that confirmed Mrs. Hayes's warnings. Heavy snow blanketed the valley by mid-December, making the road to town passable only by sleigh and only on the clearest days. The ranch became an island unto itself, the outside world reduced to occasional visitors bearing mail and news. Eleanor found herself relishing the isolation rather than dreading it. The big house, once empty and echoing, had become truly home, filled with Thomas's steady presence, Mrs. Hayes's gruff affection, and the anticipation of new life growing within her. Christmas brought unexpected joy when Jackson Reed announced his engagement to Widow Peterson, a kind-faced woman who had moved to Elkhorn Falls the previous spring. Lily, initially wary of a stepmother, was won over by Mrs. Peterson's genuine interest in her education and ambitions. "She says I might attend the Teachers' College in Helena when I'm older," Lily confided to Eleanor, as they decorated pine boughs for the Christmas table. "If I keep up with my studies, that's wonderful," Eleanor replied warmly. "You'd make an excellent teacher." Lily flushed with pleasure. "I want to be like you, helping others see what they're capable of becoming." The simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. When she'd answered Thomas's advertisement nearly a year ago, she'd been seeking security and respect. She never imagined she might also become someone's inspiration. January brought the harshest weather of the season, blizzards that howled around the house for days, temperatures that froze water buckets solid in the barn. Thomas spent hours ensuring the cattle had access to feed and unfrozen water, returning to the house with ice crusting his beard and eyebrows. During one particularly fierce storm, Eleanor sat by the fire with Mrs. Hayes, working on the quilt they'd begun in November. The older woman's right hand remained largely useless, but her left managed the needle with practiced skill, and her critical eye ensured Eleanor's stitches met her exacting standards. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Hayes remarked, nodding, toward the window where wind-driven snow obscured the view. "What day is that?" Eleanor asked, securing a particularly troublesome stitch. "The day I'd be grateful to be snowed in with an Eastern mail-order bride," Mrs. Hayes replied, her tone gruff but affectionate. "Life takes strange turns, Mrs. Mitchell," Eleanor smiled. "Indeed it does, Mrs. Hayes. Indeed it does." February brought a brief thaw, allowing Thomas to make the journey to town for supplies and mail. He returned with letters from Martha, news of spring cattle prices, and an unexpected package from Gregory Wharton. What could Gregory possibly be sending? Eleanor wondered, opening the carefully wrapped parcel. Inside lay a leather-bound volume of Tennyson's complete works, a replacement for the worn copy Eleanor had brought from Philadelphia, and a brief note. "Eleanor, Martha speaks often of your happiness in Montana. It seems the West has provided what Philadelphia could not, appreciation for qualities of true worth. Please accept this small token of my belated understanding. Your cousin, Gregory." Eleanor traced the embossed cover, oddly moved by this acknowledgement, from a man who had once viewed her with barely concealed disapproval. "A thoughtful gift," Thomas observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and perhaps a sign that minds can change, given time and evidence." As winter grudgingly yielded to spring, Eleanor's body changed with the seasons. Her already substantial figure expanded as the baby grew, but for the first time in her life, she felt no shame in her size. This roundness had purpose, contained new life, represented hope for the future. Thomas treated her changing body with reverence, his hands gentle on the curve of her belly where their child moved and kicked. "Strong," he observed one evening, feeling a particularly vigorous movement. "Like its mother," Eleanor laughed, "or stubborn like its father." By May, Preparations for the baby's arrival occupied much of Eleanor's attention. The small room adjacent to their bedroom was transformed with a handcrafted crib Thomas had built during the winter evenings, a rocking chair brought from town, and the completed quilt that represented Mrs. Hayes's unlikely friendship. Word arrived that Martha planned to visit after the birth, bringing fabric for a christening gown, and news from Philadelphia. Sarah Johnson organized the women of Elkhorn Falls to prepare meals that could be easily reheated during Eleanor's confinement. Most surprisingly, Mrs. Wilson appeared at Whispering Pines one afternoon in early June, bearing a basket of baby clothes. "And an awkward apology. I behaved abominably when you first arrived," she admitted, as she and Eleanor sorted through the tiny garments. "I allowed prejudice to blind me to your character. I hope you can forgive an old woman's foolishness." Eleanor considered the woman who had once been her most vocal critic. "We all make judgments based on limited information, Mrs. Wilson. What matters is our willingness to reconsider when presented with new evidence." The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "You've taught our town a valuable lesson, Mrs. Mitchell, one I hope we remember." As June progressed, the heat became oppressive. Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching, her ankles swelling despite frequent rest. Dr. Wilson, visiting weekly now, assured her these symptoms were normal, particularly for a first pregnancy at her age. "Everything is progressing as it should," he confirmed after his examination. "The baby's positioned correctly, and your overall health is excellent. I'd expect delivery within the next 2 weeks." Thomas arranged for Lily to stay at the ranch, ready to ride for the doctor when labor began. Mrs. Hayes, now able to navigate short distances with a cane, prepared the downstairs for the birth, insisting Eleanor would be more comfortable in the cooler ground floor rooms. Labor began on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. Eleanor woke before dawn, a persistent ache in her lower back, gradually resolving into unmistakable contractions. She woke Thomas gently, her voice calm despite the pain. "It's time," she said simply. What followed was 18 hours of the most intense experience of Eleanor's life. Dr. Wilson arrived mid-morning, confirming that her labor was progressing normally, if slowly. Thomas refused to leave her side despite the doctor's suggestion that birthing was women's business. "She's my wife," he said firmly. "I won't have her face this alone." Throughout the long hours, Eleanor drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Each contraction brought pain that threatened to overwhelm her, yet between them came moments of clarity. Thomas's hand gripping hers, Mrs. Hayes's unexpected tenderness as she bathed Eleanor's forehead, Lily's wide-eyed concern as she delivered fresh linens. As twilight descended on the longest day, Eleanor's efforts finally bore fruit. With a last tremendous push, she brought their child into the world, a robust daughter with a shock of dark hair and her father's determined chin. "A girl," Dr. Wilson announced, clearing the baby's airways as she drew her first breath and released. A powerful cry, and a healthy one by the sound of it. Thomas, who had remained steadfast throughout the ordeal, found himself momentarily speechless as the doctor placed their daughter in Eleanor's arms. The expression on his face, wonder mixed with profound love, was one Eleanor would remember all her days. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny hand. "Absolutely perfect." "What will you call her?" Mrs. Hayes asked from the doorway, her usual briskness softened by the moment. Eleanor looked down at the small face, already showing signs of her father's features. "Martha Grace," she decided, "after my cousin who encouraged me to seek happiness, and for the grace that brought me to Thomas." "A fine name," Mrs. Hayes approved, "for a fine Mitchell girl." In the days that followed, visitors came to Whispering Pines to welcome Martha Grace, Sarah Johnson bearing books for when the child was older, Reverend and Mrs. Parker bringing a silver christening cup, even Melissa Carson and her banker fiancé, paying their respects with an expensive blanket from Helena. Each visitor remarked on the baby's beauty, her strong lungs, her alert eyes. None mentioned Eleanor's size or made the cruel comments that had greeted her own arrival in Elkhorn Falls a year earlier. "It's as though they've forgotten how they once spoke about me," Eleanor observed to Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Or perhaps they've simply found more important things to consider." Thomas smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "People see what they're looking for, Eleanor. When you arrived, they looked for reasons to judge. Now they look for the woman who's earned their respect, the teacher who improved their children's education, the neighbor who organized relief when the Sanders family lost their barn to lightning, the wife who's made Whispering Pines thrive as never before." "You give me too much credit," Eleanor demurred. "And you take too little," Thomas countered. "Do you remember what I wrote in my reply to your first letter? That I sought a partner, not an ornament?" Eleanor nodded, the memory vivid despite the passage of time. "I got far more than I hoped for," Thomas continued. "A true partner, yes, but also a woman of extraordinary grace and strength. A woman who's transformed not just my life, but this entire community through the simple act of being herself, regardless of others' judgments." Eleanor looked down at their sleeping daughter, already showing signs of a sturdy build, like her mother's. "I hope she inherits your steady nature," she said softly, "and that she grows up in a world that values character above appearances." "She will," Thomas assured her, "because she'll have you to show her the way." As twilight deepened into night, the first stars appearing above the mountains that cradled Whispering Pines, Eleanor Mitchell sat beside the husband who had seen beyond, her sighs to the woman beneath, their daughter cradled in her arms. The journey from lonely Philadelphia spinster to beloved wife and mother had not been easy, but each challenge had shaped her into the woman she had become, strong, respected, confident in her worth. The mail-order bride, once mocked for her size, had found not just acceptance, but celebration of all she was and all she had to give. In Thomas Mitchell's steady love and her daughter's innocent trust, Eleanor had discovered the truth that had eluded her throughout her earlier life. That true beauty resides not in conforming to others' expectations, but in the courage to live authentically despite them. "I love you," Thomas said quietly, the simple declaration containing worlds of meaning. "And I love you," Eleanor replied, equally simple, equally profound. Beyond the porch rail, fireflies danced in the summer darkness, their brief, brilliant lights illuminating the path home. A path Eleanor Adams Mitchell had found, not by changing who she was, but by finding those with the vision to see the beauty that had been there all along. 5 years passed at Whispering Pines, each season bringing new challenges and joys to the Mitchell family. Little Martha Grace, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's determined chin and her mother's quick intelligence, raced across the ranch yard, her dark braids flying behind her. "Mama! Papa! Look what I found!" she called, clutching something. Carefully in her chubby hands, Eleanor looked up from the garden she was tending, brushing soil from her skirts as she rose. At 33, she remained a woman of substantial size, but the years of ranch work had transformed softness into strength. Her figure, once a source of mockery, now reflected capability and health. "What treasure have you discovered, my darling?" she asked as Martha skidded to a stop before her. The child opened her hands to reveal a robin's egg, its delicate blue shell intact. It was on the ground by the big pine. The nest must have fallen. Thomas approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "That's quite a find," he agreed, crouching beside his daughter. "But a baby bird needs its egg to grow strong." "Can we help it?" Martha asked, her expression serious beyond her years. "Perhaps," Eleanor suggested. "Let's see if we can locate the nest." Together, the family walked to the towering pine at the edge of the yard. Thomas lifted Martha onto his shoulders to peer into the lower branches. "There," she pointed. "I see it." Sure enough, a nest sat slightly askew on a branch, a mother robin watching anxiously from nearby. "If we're very careful," Thomas said, lifting the egg from Martha's hand, "we might be able to return this to where it belongs." With Eleanor steadying his ladder, Thomas climbed high enough to gently place the egg back in its nest. The mother bird fluttered nervously but didn't abandon her. "Home, will the baby be all right now?" Martha asked as Thomas descended. "Nature is resilient," Eleanor assured her. "With proper care and a little luck, even things that seem fragile can thrive in unexpected places." Thomas met her gaze over their daughter's head, both recognizing the parallel to their own unlikely story, a mail-order bride finding her place in the harsh Montana wilderness, blossoming where others had predicted failure. The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted the moment. Jackson Reed, his hair now completely grey but his back still straight in the saddle, rode beside it as escort. "Company coming," Thomas observed. "And if I'm not mistaken, that's Sarah Johnson's wagon." Eleanor smiled in anticipation. Sarah had become her dearest friend in Elkhorn Falls, though visits had grown less frequent since the birth of Sarah's twins 3 years earlier. "Perhaps she's bringing Daniel and David," Eleanor suggested, knowing how Martha adored playing with the younger children. Martha immediately brightened, racing toward the approaching wagon. "Aunt Sarah, did you bring the boys?" Sarah Johnson laughed as she drew the horses to a halt. "Indeed I did, Miss Martha. They've talked of nothing but visiting the ranch all week." 2 identical tow-headed boys scrambled down from the wagon immediately, engaging Martha in some complex game of their own devising. The children ran toward the corral, their excited voices carrying on the summer breeze. "They'll sleep well tonight," Sarah remarked, accepting Thomas's hand to descend from the wagon seat. "Nothing like a day at Whispering Pines to tire out city children. Elkhorn Falls is hardly a metropolis," Eleanor laughed, embracing her friend. "Compared to this peaceful haven, it might as well be Chicago," Sarah replied. "Though I bring news that might disrupt your tranquility." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, nothing serious, I hope?" "That depends on your perspective." Sarah extracted a folded newspaper from her basket. "This arrived on yesterday's train. I thought you should see it before Sunday services." The newspaper was from Helena, dated the previous week. Sarah pointed to a small article halfway down the page. "Carson Banking Dynasty expands to Elkhorn Falls." The Carson Financial Group, under the direction of Harold Carson and son-in-law Everett Williams, has announced plans to establish a branch in the growing community of Elkhorn Falls. Mr. Williams, who married Melissa Carson 3 years ago, will oversee operations at the new location. "Elkhorn Falls has shown remarkable growth," Williams stated. "The ranching community deserves modern banking services without the inconvenience of traveling to Helena." The Carsons, long established as cattle ranchers in Montana Territory, expanded into banking 5 years ago. Their financial institutions now serve 3 communities, with Elkhorn Falls becoming the 4th this autumn. Eleanor finished reading, her expression thoughtful. "So, Melissa and her husband are returning to Elkhorn Falls, after making it quite clear when they married that Elena's society was far superior," Sarah added with a touch of irony. "Mrs. Wilson is beside herself with excitement. She's already planning a welcome dinner at the church." Thomas, who had read over Eleanor's shoulder, shrugged. "It's good for the town to have a bank. Saves the risk of carrying cash to Helena. Always." "The practical one," Eleanor smiled, touching his arm affectionately. And you're right, of course, though I imagine Mrs. Wilson expects me to be dismayed by Melissa's triumphant return. Are you? Sarah asked candidly. Eleanor considered the question. Honestly, 5 years ago, Melissa Carson had been a painful reminder of the type of woman society expected Thomas to choose. Slender, conventionally pretty, from a prominent local family. She had made no secret of her belief that Thomas had settled for Eleanor out of desperation rather than genuine preference. No, Eleanor decided, Melissa is part of a past that holds no power over my present. Thomas and I have built a life together that stands on its own merits. Thomas's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture of support that had become as natural as breathing. The Carsons and Williamses aren't the only ones who've prospered, he reminded her. Whispering Pines has doubled its herd since we married, and that new irrigation system means we'll weather droughts better than most. Not to mention your reputation as the finest teacher in the county, Sarah added. Half the families in Elkhorn Falls credit you with their children's educational achievements. Eleanor flushed slightly at the praise. What had begun as informal lessons for Lily had evolved into a small school held 3 days weekly in a converted storeroom at Whispering Pines. Children from neighboring ranches rode for miles to attend, their parents recognizing the value of Eleanor's Philadelphia education. Speaking of which, Sarah continued, that's the other reason for my visit. The town council met yesterday. They voted to build a proper schoolhouse in Elkhorn Falls, and they want you to be the official teacher. Eleanor blinked in surprise. A real school in town. With a salary and everything, Sarah confirmed. Reverend Parker says it's long overdue, and even Mrs. Wilson admitted no one else has your qualifications. That's wonderful news, Thomas said warmly. You've earned this recognition, Eleanor. But the ranch, Eleanor began, is doing so well we can spare you 3 days a week, Thomas finished for her. And Martha's old enough to start her formal education. She could accompany you to town. Eleanor felt a swell of emotion at this tangible evidence of how thoroughly her position in the community had transformed. From an object of ridicule to a respected educator, the journey seemed almost unbelievable. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. It's a significant change. Of course, Sarah agreed. The school won't be completed until spring anyway. You have time to consider. That evening, after their visitors had departed, and Martha was tucked into bed with a story about brave princesses who rescued themselves, Eleanor and Thomas sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight. You're still thinking about the school, Thomas observed, knowing his wife's contemplative silence. Among other things, Eleanor admitted, Melissa's return, the school opportunity. How much has changed since I first stepped off that train? Thomas took her hand, his calloused fingers familiar and comforting against her skin. Do you ever regret it? Answering my advertisement coming west? Never, Eleanor replied without hesitation. Even in the beginning, when the town's judgment was at its harshest, I found more acceptance here than I ever knew in Philadelphia. Not from everyone, Thomas reminded her, his tone darkening at the memory of those early slights. No, but from the one person who mattered most. Eleanor squeezed his hand. You saw me, Thomas. Not just my size, but me. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? Thomas lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I saw a woman of intelligence, courage, and grace. I still do, every day. The simple sincerity in his voice warmed Eleanor as deeply as it had when they'd first met. After 5 years of marriage, Thomas Mitchell remained a man of few words, but those he chose carried the weight of absolute truth. The school position, she said after a moment. I think I should accept it. Thomas nodded unsurprised. You'd be exceptional, as you are at everything you undertake. It would mean being in town more regularly, Eleanor pointed out. Seeing the Williamses frequently. Does that concern you? Eleanor considered the question honestly. No, she decided. Whatever history lies between us belongs to the past. We've all moved forward with our lives. Thomas smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes in the way Eleanor had always found endearing. That's my wise wife, always finding the generous perspective. The following Sunday, Eleanor wore her best dress to church, a deep blue garment that complemented her auburn hair, now threaded with occasional strands of silver. Martha skipped alongside her, resplendent in a pinafore Eleanor had sewn from fabric Sarah had brought from Helena. As always, Thomas walked beside them, his presence solid and reassuring. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something lasting, both in his ranch and his family. The church hummed with anticipation, news of the bank and the school providing ample fodder for conversation. Eleanor moved through the gathering with practiced ease, accepting congratulations on her upcoming teaching position with gracious modesty. Mrs. Mitchell, Reverend Parker greeted her warmly. The school board couldn't have made a finer choice. You've demonstrated extraordinary commitment to our children's education. Thank you, Reverend, Eleanor replied. Though it's been a community effort, parents who value learning make teaching a joy. As they spoke, a stir at the church entrance drew their attention. Melissa Williams entered on her husband's arm, as slender and fashionable as ever, in an expensive dress clearly purchased in Helena, or perhaps even St. Louis. Everett Williams, a distinguished man with side whiskers and wire-rimmed spectacles, surveyed the gathering with the confident air of someone accustomed to respect. Mrs. Wilson hurried forward to greet them, her effusive welcome carrying across the churchyard. Other townspeople followed, eager to make a good impression on the couple who would control the region's first bank. Eleanor remained where she was, allowing the initial flurry of attention to proceed without her. She felt Thomas's supportive presence beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "Should we say hello?" he asked quietly. "Of course," Eleanor replied. "It would be conspicuous not to welcome new residents to the community." They approached, as the initial crowd around the Williamses thinned. Melissa's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Eleanor, her composed expression faltering momentarily before she recovered. "Thomas, Eleanor," she greeted them, her voice carefully modulated. "How lovely to see you both again." "Welcome back to Elkhorn Falls," Thomas said, extending his hand to Everett Williams. "Your bank will be a valuable addition to the community." "Mitchell," Williams acknowledged, his handshake firm. "I've heard a great deal about Whispering Pines Ranch. Impressive operation by all accounts." "We've been fortunate," Thomas replied modestly. Melissa's gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in her confident posture and serene expression. "And Mrs. Mitchell, I understand congratulations are in order. The new schoolteacher, I hear." "The position has been offered," Eleanor confirmed. "It's an honor to be considered." A small figure darted between them suddenly. Martha, having escaped her conversation with the Johnson twins. "Mama, Daniel says there's going to be ice cream after church. Is that true?" Eleanor smiled, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "For the welcoming celebration, yes. Martha, these are Mr. and Mrs. Williams. They're going to be new neighbors in town." Martha executed a perfect curtsy, just as Eleanor had taught her. "Pleased to meet you," she said politely. "Do you have children too?" A shadow passed across Melissa's face. "No," she said, her voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "We don't." "Martha, why don't you find Lily?" Thomas suggested, recognizing the awkward moment. "I believe she's brought something special for you." The child nodded and darted away, her attention easily redirected at the mention of Lily, who had become like an older sister to her. "She's lovely," Melissa said after a moment. "She has your eyes, Thomas." "And her mother's intelligence," Thomas replied, We're very blessed. An uncomfortable silence threatened to descend, years of unspoken history hanging between them. Eleanor, drawing on the grace that had become her hallmark, broke it gently. You must both be exhausted from your journey. We'd be delighted to have you for dinner at Whispering Pines once you're settled. The view of the valley is particularly beautiful this time of year. Melissa appeared genuinely startled by the invitation, her carefully maintained composure slipping to reveal something like confusion. That's very kind of you, Eleanor. Not at all, Eleanor replied sincerely. New beginnings deserve celebration, and you'll find Elkhorn Falls has changed considerably in the past 5 years. As have we all, it seems, Melissa observed, her gaze moving between Eleanor and Thomas, noting their easy intimacy, the subtle touches and glances that spoke of deep connection. Change is the nature of life, Eleanor agreed. Sometimes for the better, if we're fortunate. The church bell rang, summoning the congregation inside. As they moved toward the entrance, Everett leaned down to whisper something in Melissa's ear that made her glance back at Eleanor with a puzzled expression. "What do you suppose that was about?" Thomas murmured, as they took their usual pew. Eleanor smiled slightly. "If I had to guess, Mr. Williams was probably asking why his wife never mentioned that the large, plain, mail-order bride she once disparaged has become one of the most respected women in the community." Thomas chuckled softly, "Not to mention one of the most beautiful." "Now you're being kind," Eleanor demurred. "I'm being truthful," Thomas corrected, his gaze warm with admiration. "You grow more beautiful to me each year, Eleanor Mitchell." The autumn brought changes to Elkhorn Falls. Construction began on both the bank and the schoolhouse, transforming the main street with the sounds of hammers and saws. Eleanor divided her time between ranch responsibilities, preparations for her expanded teaching role, and keeping up with Martha's seemingly boundless energy. October brought the unexpected appearance of Martha's cousin Amelia, Eleanor's niece from Philadelphia, now a poised young woman of 22. "Aunt Eleanor," she cried, embracing Eleanor as she stepped down from the stage. "You look wonderful." "As do you," Eleanor replied, genuinely pleased by the surprise visit. "Your mother didn't mention you were coming west." Amelia linked her arm through Eleanor's as they walked toward the wagon where Thomas waited. "That's because she doesn't know yet. I've done something terribly scandalous, Aunt Eleanor. I've run away." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Run away? At 22? From what, precisely?" "From an exceedingly advantageous marriage to an exceedingly boring banker old enough to be my father," Amelia declared. "Mother is beside herself, of course. Father is threatening to disown me. So I decided to seek refuge with the only family member who might understand choosing an unconventional path." Eleanor suppressed a smile at her niece's dramatic delivery. "I see. And what do you plan to do now that you've fled Philadelphia society?" "Well, that's where I hope you might advise me," Amelia admitted. "I have some savings, and I'm quite good with figures. Father insisted I learn to manage household accounts properly. Beyond that," she shrugged expressively. Thomas greeted Amelia warmly, helping her into the wagon before securing her trunk. "Any family of Eleanor's is welcome at Whispering Pines," he assured her. "For as long as you need." During the ride to the ranch, Amelia chattered about Philadelphia gossip and her journey west, but Eleanor sensed an underlying seriousness beneath her niece's light-hearted manner. Later that evening, after Martha had been tucked into bed, excited by the novelty of her glamorous cousin's visit, Amelia sought Eleanor out in the parlor. "Aunt Eleanor," she began hesitantly, "I wasn't entirely forthcoming earlier." Eleanor set aside her mending. "Oh, the marriage father arranged," I might have considered it, despite Mr. Harrison's age and tedious conversation about banking regulations, but he made it very clear what he expected of a wife. Amelia's cheeks flushed. He said I was fortunate that a man of his position would consider someone so substantial. Eleanor felt a pang of recognition. Amelia, while not as large as Eleanor, had inherited the family tendency toward a fuller figure, a trait that Philadelphia society viewed with the same disapproval Eleanor had once faced. "I see," she said quietly. "When I objected to his assessment, Father took me aside and reminded me that women in my situation cannot afford to be particular." Amelia's voice tightened with hurt. "He said I should be grateful for any offer. As if I were damaged goods being sold at discount." Thomas, entering from his study, paused in the doorway. "Your father said this to you?" Amelia nodded, wiping an angry tear. "He did. And Mother agreed with him, though she at least had the grace to look uncomfortable about it." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Thomas, seeing her own anger reflected in his expression. "Gregory hasn't changed as much as I'd hoped," she sighed. "So I ran," Amelia continued. "I couldn't bear the thought of spending my life with a man who saw me as something to be settled for rather than chosen." She looked up at Eleanor, vulnerability clear in her young face. "Was I foolish to give up security for dignity?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Never. Your worth isn't determined by the narrow judgments of others, Amelia. It resides in your character, your intelligence, your capacity for kindness and growth." "But what am I to do now?" Amelia asked. "I have enough money for a few months, but then—" Eleanor considered the young woman before her, educated, intelligent, and far braver than she gave herself credit for. "Do you remember Mrs. Williams, who recently returned to Elkhorn Falls with her husband to open the bank?" Amelia nodded. "You mentioned her in your letters. Didn't she once have designs on Uncle Thomas?" "Ancient history," Eleanor dismissed with a smile. "The point is, Mr. Williams mentioned at church last Sunday that he's seeking someone with mathematical aptitude to assist with the bank's accounts. Your skills might be precisely what he needs." "Work at a bank? As a woman?" Amelia looked startled, then intrigued by the possibility. "Do you think he would consider me?" "I think he would be fortunate to have you," Eleanor replied. "And unlike Philadelphia, Elkhorn Falls has learned to look beyond appearances to recognize true value." The following morning, Eleanor took Amelia to town, introducing her to the Williamses at their temporary office behind the general store. Everett Williams, impressed by Amelia's quick intelligence and familiarity with financial matters, offered her a trial position on the spot. $3 per week to start, he specified. "More if you prove as capable as your aunt suggests." Melissa, watching the exchange with interest, pulled Eleanor aside as the others discussed details. "You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. Most women would hesitate to introduce a pretty young relative to their husband's former friend." "Amelia isn't competition, Melissa," Eleanor replied gently. "She's in need of assistance. Besides, Thomas and I don't base our marriage on insecurity or suspicion." Melissa studied her, something like wistfulness crossing her features. "No, I don't suppose you do. You know, I envied you for years. Told myself Thomas had settled for you out of practicality, that he must regret his choice." "And now," Eleanor asked, "now I see what everyone else in this town apparently realized long ago," Melissa admitted. "That Thomas Mitchell made the wisest choice possible when he sent for you. That true partnership is worth more than any superficial attraction." The candid admission touched Eleanor deeply. "Thank you for saying that, Melissa. I hope you found similar contentment with Mr. Williams." "Everett is a good man," Melissa said after a slight hesitation. "Our marriage is satisfactory." The careful choice of words spoke volumes. Eleanor felt a sudden compassion for the woman who had once been her most vocal critic. "If you ever need a friend, Melissa, my door is always open." Melissa's eyes widened, in genuine surprise. "After how I treated you when you first arrived, the things I said at the Carsons' dance?" "The past remains where it belongs," Eleanor said simply. "We're different women now. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Elkhorn Falls in snow by mid-November. Amelia, now firmly established at the bank and boarding with Sarah Johnson's family in town, thrived in her new position. Her mathematical precision and organizational skills quickly made her indispensable to Everett Williams, who increased her salary after just 1 month. The schoolhouse, completed ahead of schedule, thanks to an unexpectedly mild autumn, stood ready for its first classes in January. Eleanor spent hours arranging the single room with its neat rows of desks, blackboard, and small library, mostly books donated from her own collection or purchased with funds raised by the Ladies' Aid Society. "You've created something remarkable," Thomas observed one evening in early December as Eleanor reviewed her teaching plans by the fire. "From informal lessons in our storeroom to an official school with 28 pupils enrolled. It's still hard to believe," Eleanor admitted. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought my teaching days were behind me." "You've always been a teacher." Thomas disagreed. "To Lily, to Martha, to everyone around you, you taught this town to see beyond appearances. You taught Mrs. Hayes that strength can coexist with gentleness. You even taught me to recognize love when it was standing right before me." Eleanor set aside her papers, deeply moved by his words. "We taught each other, I think." Thomas gathered her into his arms, her substantial figure fitting against his as perfectly as it had from the first. "Do you remember what you wrote in your initial letter about not being conventionally beautiful?" Eleanor nodded, recalling her painful honesty in that first communication. "I thought it only fair to warn you. I've been meaning to tell you something about that letter," Thomas said. "I received 17 responses to my advertisement. Most were from women who described themselves in flattering terms: slender, pretty, accomplished. But yours was the only one that spoke of books and poetry, that showed intelligence and honesty." "You never told me there were so many others," Eleanor said, surprised. "Because they didn't matter," Thomas replied simply. "From the moment I read your words, something in me recognized what I truly needed. Not an ornament or a decorative companion, but a partner in every sense. Someone with the courage to be completely honest, even when it was difficult." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely tender. "My dearest Eleanor, you thought you were warning me away by mentioning your size. In truth, your honesty was drawing me toward you, toward the remarkable woman beneath the surface that so many failed to see." Eleanor's vision blurred with unexpected tears. "Even after all these years, you still managed to surprise me, Thomas Mitchell." "Good," he smiled. "I intend to keep surprising you for at least another 50. Christmas brought the entire community together for a celebration at the newly completed schoolhouse. Even Mrs. Hayes attended, now able to walk short distances with only a cane for support. Martha and the Johnson twins performed a nativity scene, their childish voices filling the room with ancient words of hope and new beginnings. As Eleanor looked around at the gathered faces, Sarah Johnson arranging refreshments, Lily helping, younger children with their costumes, Amelia deep in conversation with Dr. Wilson's nephew, who had recently arrived from Chicago, the Williamses seated near the front, Melissa's expression softer than Eleanor had ever seen it. She felt a profound sense of belonging. This community that had once judged her so harshly had become home. These people who had once whispered behind their hands at the sight of Thomas Mitchell's large, mail-order bride now looked to her with respect and genuine affection. Later, as snow fell gently outside the schoolhouse windows and voices joined, In Carol's, Thomas slipped his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Happy?" he asked softly. Eleanor leaned against him, watching Martha proudly show her cousin Amelia the Christmas drawing she'd created. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied. "And you?" "I sent for a bride and received a miracle," Thomas said simply. "What do you think?" As the new year approached, bringing with it Eleanor's first official day as Elkhorn Falls' school teacher, she often thought about the journey that had led her here, from a lonely Philadelphia spinster mocked for her size to a woman whose value was recognized and celebrated. The mail-order bride advertisement that had once seemed her last desperate chance at a respectable life had instead opened the door to something far richer. A love built on mutual respect, a family bound by genuine affection, a community that had learned to see beyond appearances to the beauty that resided in character and heart. And it had all begun because one man, one remarkable, clear-sighted rancher, had possessed the wisdom to look beyond society's narrow definitions of beauty, to recognize the treasure that had always existed beneath Eleanor Adams Mitchell's substantial exterior. In the end, it wasn't Eleanor who had been transformed by her journey west, but everyone around her, taught by her quiet dignity to recognize that true beauty is never about size or shape or conformity to others' expectations. It resides instead in courage, in kindness, in facing life's challenges with grace and an open heart. As Thomas had said on that long-ago day when she first stepped off the train in Elkhorn Falls, he was a rancher, and ranchers valued substance over appearance. In finding a man who could truly see her, Eleanor Adams Mitchell had finally gloriously seen herself, not as the burden society had labeled her, but as the gift she had always been. 10 years after Eleanor Adams first stepped off the train in Elkhorn Falls, Whispering Pines Ranch hosted a celebration that brought together the entire community. Tables laden with food stretched across the yard, lanterns hung from tree branches, and fiddle music filled the air as neighbors gathered to commemorate a decade of the Mitchells' marriage. Eleanor, now a respected figure in the county as both schoolteacher and rancher's wife, moved among her guests with easy confidence. At 40, she remained a woman of substantial size, but what visitors noticed now was her warmth, her intelligence, and the quiet authority she carried. "Mrs. Mitchell," called Reverend Parker, raising his glass, a toast to the woman who taught Elkhorn Falls its most valuable lesson. Conversations quieted as people turned toward the minister. 10 years ago, many of us made judgments based on appearances, he continued, his voice carrying across the gathering. We couldn't see beyond what was visible to recognize the remarkable woman who had come among us. Eleanor Mitchell showed us, through patience and dignity, that true beauty lies in character, in kindness, and in the courage to remain oneself despite others' expectations. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Wilson, now one of Eleanor's staunchest supporters, nodded emphatically. "To Eleanor," Sarah Johnson added, "who transformed our town not by changing herself, but by changing how we see." Thomas stepped forward, taking Eleanor's hand. "And to the finest partner a man could ask for," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The mail-order bride who became the heart of Whispering Pines." As glasses were raised and cheers echoed across the yard, Eleanor felt a tug at her skirt. 10-year-old Martha stood beside her 7-year-old brother James, both children inheriting their mother's intelligence and their father's determined spirit. "Mama," Martha whispered, "Miss Amelia says this celebration is because you were brave. Enough to come west when everyone thought you shouldn't." Eleanor smiled at her daughter, then glanced across the yard, where Amelia stood beside her husband, Dr. Wilson's nephew, who had recognized in her the same qualities Thomas had seen in Eleanor. Their 2-year-old daughter tottered nearby, watched over by Mrs. Hayes, whose gruff exterior had long since given way to genuine devotion to the Mitchell family. "It's because your father was wise enough to look beyond what others saw," Eleanor corrected gently, "and because this community was willing to learn from its mistakes." Later, as twilight deepened and guests began departing, Eleanor and Thomas stood on the porch of the home they had built together. Below in the yard, Martha taught a group of children a dance she had created, while James solemnly explained the constellations to anyone who would listen. "Happy?" Thomas asked, echoing the question he had asked many times over the years. Eleanor leaned against him, surveying all they had created together, not just the prosperous ranch or their beautiful children, but the community that had learned, through their example, that love sees clearly when it looks beyond appearances, more than words can express, she answered truthfully. "To think that it all began with an advertisement and a letter." "No," Thomas corrected, drawing her close. "It began with courage, yours in writing honestly about yourself, mine in recognizing what truly mattered. The rest was simply our journey to where we were always meant to be." As stars appeared in the Montana sky, Eleanor Adams Mitchell stood, beside the husband who had seen the beauty beneath her sighs, surrounded by the life they had built through mutual respect and genuine love. The mail-order bride, once mocked for her appearance, had become the woman whose story would be told for generations in Elkhorn Falls, a testament to seeing with the heart rather than the eyes, and to the transformative power of being truly, completely seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.